Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to now call upon our Chief Financial Officer, Ms. Zandile Mafata, who will take us through the audited financial statements. Uh, Over to you, Zandi. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Greetings to the HWSETA board under the leadership of Dr. Mnisi. Greetings to the staff and executive of the HWSETA under the leadership of Ms. Elaine Brass. And lastly, but certainly not least in importance, greetings to our stakeholders and all our invited guests. Thank you for joining us in our AGM this morning. I will be presenting the financial overview of the HWSETA for the period ended 31 March 2021. These financial statements were audited by the Auditor General, and the details of my presentation is included in the annual report that was emailed to you as part of the agenda and the minutes for this session today. With that, then I will go on to my presentation. And if you can go to the next slide. Thanks, Veronica. So in terms of our key financial facts, starting with revenue, our revenue for the period was 561 million. This was a 3.9% above budget of 541 million and a 28.6% a decline compared to the previous year when we had 787 million. And this decline was mainly due to the skills development levy contribution holiday. You will recall that 2020, 2021 was a different year. At the beginning of the year, we were hit with COVID, and the whole world economy, South Africa not excluded, was affected. And to that end, the state president announced a stimulus package. And as part of that stimulus package, there was a 4-month skills contribution holiday that was afforded to you, our stakeholders. That holiday did impact on our revenue as HWSETA, and it also required us to revise our budget. And that is why 2021 revenue is 28.6% lower than the 2020 revenue. The 561 million that I referred to is made up of skills development levy income, and for the period we collected 367 million, and this is the area that was significantly affected by the 4-month contribution holiday. This 367 million was 9.6% lower than budget of 406 million, and this was a revised budget, and it was 31.9% lower than the actual of the previous financial year, which was 539 million. The other line item making up our revenue is our government levy. We collected 169 million. And this 169 million was 61.8% higher than budget of 104 million and 7.6% lower than 2019-20 actual of 183 million. And I think at this stage, I would like to thank our health and social development departments because they really carried us through the 2020-2021. You can see that from a revised budget of 104, because we were as conservative as we possibly could be when we did the revised budget, we were able to collect 169 million. Our other line item making up revenue is interest income. This is interest on our funds in our bank account as well as our investments. Our interest revenue was 26 million for the year. That was 15.6% lower than budget of 31 million and 59.8% lower than the previous financial year when we earned 64 million. And the reason for this decline was mainly due to, I've mentioned the income coming in affected by these skills development contribution holiday, and also the extent of the outflow with the discretionary grants disbursement. And you will see as I proceed with with my presentation. Revenue collection, this is the graph that depicts our revenue collected. I indicated that with regards to the skills development levy, we were lower compared to the previous financial year, as well as our budget. And this despite the fact that our skills development levy contributors increased by I think it's about 1.1% to 11,103. Collection on government levy, we collected 100% of our government levies. That is why I said, a special thank you to our health and social development departments. They really carried us through last year. Interest was lower, as can be depicted in the revenue collection, and as indicated, we had a cash outflow far exceeding our cash inflow, and also with the repo rate being reduced or left unchanged, this impacted on the interest rate that we earning on our funds that was in the bank. Next slide, please. In terms of our expenditure for the year, total expenditure was 992 million. This was 4.7% lower than budget of 1 billion and 11.1% higher than the previous financial year at 893 million. Our expenditure is made up of, that 992, is made up of discretionary grant payments of 789 million. We disbursed 789 million in support of our sector, all the projects that we had committed to as the HWSETA. We spent 789 million, and this was 4.7% lower than budget at 828 million, but 20.8% higher than what we disbursed in the previous financial year at 653 million. Our mandatory grants payments for the period were 53 million. This was 19.1% lower than budget at 66 million and 43.3% lower than the previous financial year at 94 million. Administrative expenditure was 150 million, and this was 4.9% higher than budget at 143 million and 2.9% higher than previous financial year at 146 million. With administrative expenditure, our ballpark is a 5% variance, and our variance both for budget as well as the previous financial year is below the ballpark of 5%. Next slide, please. This slide seeks to indicate how the discretionary grant payments for the HWSETA has taken shape in the last 5 years. And you can see from the graph that there has been a steady decline. I mean, not decline, how can it be a decline? There's been an upward trend in the expenditure on our discretionary grants, and this is in support of our sector. And we spent 789 million, and that 789 million that we spent, 400 million of our reserves was used to fund our discretionary grants for the period. Next slide, please. In terms of our mandatory grant participation rate, our participation rate for the period was 60%. This was lower than the previous financial year by 14%, where we had a 70% participation rate. We aim to grow this participation rate in the current financial year. Next slide, please. Administrative expenditure, that is the graphical representation of our administration expenditure, which was 150 million. And as indicated, it was 4.9% higher than budget and 2.9% higher than the previous financial year. And it was largely due to, among others, the bonus provision for the period that needed to be brought into account. Next slide, please. With all the revenue that we received and all the expenditure that we incurred, the HWSETA had a net deficit of 429 million. This net deficit represented 308% or was 308% higher than the previous financial year at 105 million. I, however, want to put perspective to this net deficit to say this deficit was largely due to the extent of the discretionary grant payments that we paid for the period, which was 789 million. And as I indicated, of that 789 million, approximately 400 million, or just over 400 million, was funded from our reserves. And these are the reserves that the National Treasury had granted us permission to retain in order to fund the very projects that we funded. And because we are funding these projects from reserves, that amount of reserves cannot be brought into the statement of financial position, or to those who are, old like me, the income statement, because it's income that has already been recorded in previous financial year. However, we used it to fund projects for the current year as allowed by the National Treasury. Our CAPEX, our CAPEX budget was 3 million, and we spent 2.9 million of that CAPEX budget, 2.6% lower than budget and 19.7% lower than 2019-20. And just to indicate that in 2019-20, we had our expenditure was slightly higher. That is why we are showing that 9.7%. However, looking at budget, what we had budgeted 3 million, we spent 2.9 million, which was almost in line with budget. Next slide, please. The allocation of our deficit is allocated to discretionary grants, mandatory, as well as administration expenditure. And as I had indicated, discretionary grants made up most of our deficit, and that deficit came about because the revenue that we collected was not enough to cover the expenditure. However, that expenditure, a shortfall of that expenditure was covered from our reserves. And the other parts of our deficit related to the surplus on our mandatory grants as well as our administration expenditure. Next slide, please. In terms of commitments, our commitments at year end were sitting at 1.6 billion. This is 2.2% higher than the previous financial year. And our overcommitted state at the end of the year was 319%, which is 80.2% higher than the previous financial year. Can we go to the next slide so that I can put perspective to this? The overcommitted state of 319%, just to explain it, in prior years, our commitments were being released over a period of about 2 or 3 years. This allowed the HWSETA, therefore, to build up funds in order to make good on the commitments when they became due. In recent years, the turnaround in the release of the commitments have been a lot higher. And this is demonstrated by the fact that in the last 18 to 24 months, the HWSETA has disbursed 1.5 billion in discretionary payments. With that being said, the HWSETA continues to put measures in place to ensure that sufficient funds are available in order to meet our commitments. Next slide, please. Our liquidity ratio for the period, we were sitting at 5.18 times. What liquidity ratio measures? This is looking at the ratio between our current assets and our current liabilities. So with the 5.18 times, we are saying our current liabilities are covered 5.18 times by the current assets. Although the HWSETA was liquid at the end of the financial year with our current assets exceeding our current liabilities, this was 45% lower than the liquidity ratio was in the 2019-20 financial year. And the reason for that decline is in the extent of the outflow of cash, and mainly as a result of the disbursements of discretionary grants in support of the various projects within the sector. Our solvency ratio at the end of the financial year, the HWSETA was solvent. We were solvent because our total assets now were in excess of our total liabilities, 5.31 times. That being said, that although we were solvent, our solvency ratio was 45% lower than it was in the previous financial year. And the reason is, as indicated, because of the outflow of cash that we have experienced in the last 2 years. Next slide, please. Other important facts relating to this financial year is that there were no material findings of non-compliance by the Auditor General with our supply chain management rules and regulations, meaning that all procurement that was done by the HWSETA was found by the Auditor General to have been in line with supply chain management rules and regulations as indicated in the PFMA. And further to that, we did not report any instances of fruitless and wasteful expenditure. We did, however, record irregular expenditure of 564,000. However, this irregular expenditure was not linked to supply chain management processes. It was linked to the appointment of our accounting authority. And even with that, there were certain documents that were not in place. And because of that, the expenditure incurred was deemed to be irregular. Our environment is highly regulated, so the slightest mishap does may result in irregular expenditure, and we saw with the 564,000 that we are reporting in our financial statements. And lastly, but before I get to the unqualified audit, I thought the CEO would mention this during her presentation, that our audit of performance information also received a clean report from the Auditor General. It meant that there were no material misstatements in our audit of performance information. And lastly, but certainly not least in importance, we then received an unqualified audit outcome for the year ended 31 March 2021. Next slide, please. With that being said, this is our audit history for the last financial years. For the last 4 years, we have received unqualified audit. You can see it's not a smiling face. We will accept it, but our goal as the HWSETA management and board is to go back to the glory years of 2016-17, the glory years of 2015-16, when the HWSETA obtained a clean audit. And I have no doubt in my mind that with the support of the board, the support of the executive management, the support of the HWSETA staff, we will be able to obtain a clean audit. It takes a team to achieve a clean audit. It's not a finance issue. It's not an SCM issue. It's a collective approach. And with that, this brings me to the end of my presentation, and I thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Over to you, Bob.